The conventional wisdom in the West, and this is certainly true in a place like Britain and the United States, is that Putin is responsible for this crisis. It's the Russians. They're good guys and bad guys. And of course, we are the good guys and the Russians are the bad guys. This is simply wrong. The United States mainly, but the United States and its allies are responsible for this crisis, not Putin and Russia. And the idea was to turn Ukraine into a liberal democracy like Britain, like the United States. And not only a liberal democracy, but a liberal democracy that was allied with the United States. Because again, this is all part and parcel of a strategy that is designed to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. Now, as I said to you, the most important element of the strategy is NATO expansion. And that's why the April 2008 Bucharest NATO summit is of immense importance. At the end of that April 2008 Bucharest summit, NATO announced that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO. They said, this is going to happen, period. The Russians made it unequivocally clear at that point that that is not going to happen. They drew a line in the sand. In February 22nd to be exact, February 22nd, 2014, the crisis broke out over Ukraine. And it was mainly precipitated by a coup in Ukraine that overthrew a pro-Russian leader and installed a pro-American leader. The United States was involved in that coup. The Russians went ballistic. This is hardly surprising. The Russian response, it's very important to understand this. In 2014, when the crisis first broke out into the open in response to what had happened in Bucharest in 2008, the Russian response was twofold. Number one, they took Crimea, and you should all understand Crimea is gone. It is never going back to Ukraine, one. And number two, they have said implicitly that we will destroy Ukraine, we will wreck it before we will let it become a member of NATO. This is Realpolitik 101. And the fact that people in the West, especially in places like Britain and the United States, don't understand this boggles my mind. I just don't understand it. The idea that you could take a military alliance run by the United States, the most powerful state in the world, and run it up to Russia's borders, and the Russians wouldn't be bothered by it, is simply unthinkable. We in the United States have the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says that no distant great power is allowed to form a military alliance with a country in the Western Hemisphere, and is certainly not allowed to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. The United States views the Western Hemisphere as its backyard, and it prohibits distant great powers from coming into its backyard. Well, don't you think the Russians are going to be deeply disturbed by the United States turning Ukraine into a bulwark right on its borders? Of course they are. And the Russians told us that immediately after the Bucharest summit. But of course, the Americans and their allies did not listen, because we believe that we're the good guys. we're a benign hegemon here in the United States, and we can do pretty much anything we want in the world. And for a while, it looked like we could get away with that. The crisis tamped down quite a bit after 2014. But in the fall of last year, 2021, it began to ramp up. And of course, early this year, and I'm talking about early 22, it became a full-blown crisis. And the question that we want to ask ourselves is, what happened here? And the answer is that the United States and its allies were effectively turning Ukraine into a de facto member of NATO. You want to understand that the Russians view Ukraine becoming a part of NATO as an existential threat. That's what's going on here. The Russians are sending a very clear message to the West. They're telling you, we take this threat seriously, and we are willing to use military force, if necessary, to eliminate this threat. The Russians are not fooling around here. So the Turks are giving drones. The Americans and the British are giving all sorts of other weapons to the Ukrainians. You know, of course, that we define these weapons as defensive weapons. But of course, as sophisticated IR theorists, you all know that there's no such thing as a meaningful distinction between defensive weapons and offensive weapons. As we all know from the security dilemma, what looks defensive to us looks offensive to them. You give drones to the Ukrainians. Do you think the Russians are going to view those as defensive weapons? I don't think so. So what's happening here? We're arming, we're training the Ukrainians. And if you look at how we're dealing with Ukraine diplomatically, we're basically talking about Ukraine as if it were an ally or a partner. That's the kind of rhetoric we use when we talk about Ukraine. At the same time, we're doing a number of provocative things outside of Ukraine that really bother the Russians enormously. The British foolishly run a destroyer through Russian territorial waters in the Black Sea this past summer. The Americans take a bomber and they drive it right up against the Russian coastline in the Black Sea. This really bothers the Russians, unsurprisingly. The Russians, as Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said, reached a boiling point. They had it. The obvious solution is to turn Ukraine into a neutral state, more or less a buffer between Russia on one side and NATO on the other. This is effectively what you had up until February 2014. It was NATO that changed the situation. You understand, we now have changed the rhetoric to make the Russians the bad guys. You hear all this talk that Russia is bent on creating the second coming of the Soviet Union. Russia is bent on creating a greater Russia. Nobody was arguing that we had to expand NATO to contain Russia before February 22nd, 2014. What happened on February 22nd, 2014 is this cockamamie strategy that we had invented to make Ukraine a part of NATO blew up in our face. And when it blew up in our face because of our flawed policies, we were not going to admit that we had screwed up. No, we had to blame the Russians. And of course, you hear the same argument made today. It's the Russians who are the bad guys. Putin is really dangerous. We can't negotiate with him. This is the equivalent of Munich, which is another way of saying he's the second coming of Adolf Hitler, and making a deal on Ukraine is like making a deal on Czechoslovakia in October 1938. This is all pure unadulterated nonsense. There was no threat from Russia before February 22nd, 2014. It just wasn't. We invented that story. What the ideal situation would be to create a neutral Ukraine, a Ukraine that looked a lot like the Ukraine that existed between 91 and 2014. But we can't do that. And we can't do that in large part because the Americans are unwilling to make any sorts of concessions on NATO expansion. The Russians don't want to negotiate with the Germans. They don't want to negotiate with the French, and they don't want to negotiate with the British because they understand full well that the United States runs the show. And the British will do what the United States asks them to do. The Europeans basically do what the Americans ask them to do. And if there's any country that does what the Americans ask them to do, almost axiomatically, it's Britain. The Germans and the French sometimes resist, as we know from the Iraq War in 2003. But Tony Blair was a mere cheerleader for the United States in that war. So Britain does not have much of a role to play here. The United States is the key player. I don't say that because I'm an American. And indeed, I think American policy is usually so foolish these days that it would be better if the United States had less influence. And it would be better if the Europeans, especially the Germans and the French, stood up to the Americans. It's very important to understand that at the April 2008 Bucharest summit, Germany and France were adamantly opposed to any movement to make Ukraine a member of NATO. Because Germany, and here we're talking about Angela Merkel, much to her credit, understood that this was asking for serious trouble. But it was the Americans who, as always, prevailed. So the Europeans, and here we're talking about the French and the Germans, they understood that this was a foolish thing to do, but they failed to stand up to the Americans, as is so often the case with the Europeans. The problem continues to linger, and we cannot figure out how to solve it without saying that Ukraine will not become part of NATO. And that's politically unacceptable in the West, especially after you've told the story year after year that the Russians are the bad guys and we're the good guys. If the Russians are the bad guys and they're highly aggressive, and you believe the Ukrainians have the right to this and the right to that, and you're committed to making sure that they realize these rights, it's almost impossible politically to walk away from this one. The United States has a deep-seated interest in pivoting to Asia. The United States faces a peer competitor in China. Russia is not a peer competitor. The idea that Russia is some meaningful threat to dominate Europe is a laughable argument. We have a deep-seated interest in not getting involved in Eastern Europe and pivoting to East Asia, number one. And number two, we have a deep-seated interest in having Russia as an ally against China. And instead, this foolish policy that we're locked into, and let me underline those words, locked into, this foolish policy is driving the Chinese and the Russians together. We are driving the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This is a gross violation of balance of power politics 101. So this situation is disastrous for the United States. And I want to be clear here, it's most disastrous for the Ukrainian people. You want to understand, we have led the Ukrainian people down the primrose path. They are the ones who are suffering the most as a result of these foolish policies that we pursued during the unipolar moment regarding Russia and Ukraine. And it's now blown up in our face. When you're the unipole, you are by definition the only great power on the planet. We now live in a multipolar world where there are two other great powers, Russia, which Putin brought back from the dead, and China, which has grown by leaps and bounds since the early 1990s and is now a peer competitor to the United States. In unipolarity, the United States is free to pursue all sorts of foolish policies because it doesn't pay a great price. It's usually other countries that pay for America's mistakes. And almost all the wars that we fought in the unipolar moment were unfair fights. It was Bambi versus Godzilla, and we were Godzilla. That world has gone away. If the United States gets into a fight with the Chinese over Taiwan or South China or the South China Sea, it's not going to be an unfair fight. China has formidable military capabilities, and those capabilities are growing by the month. So we, the United States, are going to have our hands full trying to contain China. There's no question about that. You want to remember that the Ukraine crisis is a vestige of the unipolar moment, right? It just sticks in our craw. We can't get rid of it. But it's in our interest to put an end to the Ukraine crisis, in large part because we want to pivot to Asia.